Jason Burns, Director of the Center for East Asian Studies, and I'm really delighted to see a good turnout on this very chilly evening. Today we're very happy to welcome Professor Yoo of Yonsei University, and Professor Cummings is going to introduce him in just a moment. But first I wanted to say a little bit about this event. It was started, this lecture series was started just a year ago as a means to bring together the East Asia community to hear major scholars talk about their current research. And Professor Yoo is actually our first speaker of this year. We hope that you will turn out for the rest of the series, which will be going on later this quarter and then next quarter. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And I also wanted to mention that our first lecturer was supposed to be Carter Eckert from Harvard, who just published a major book on the origins of militarism in Korea. He got ill last November and couldn't come, but he will be here in the spring quarter, so that'll be our second one. I don't know where to begin to talk about this friend of mine here. He was our student for typical number of years here, getting his PhD. He came to us with remarkable language capability. Jun grew up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where his father was a doctor, and he speaks Korean and English like native, but also speaks Amharic. He came here with Japanese and Chinese as well as classical Chinese, so I'm getting a hip transplant pretty soon, but I'd actually like to get a brain transplant from Ted so I could be as linguistically skilled as he is. He was a wonderful student. He doesn't want me to tell you this, but it's a very good lesson for you graduate students here. Ted didn't do all that well on his oral exams. And he came in my office with an ashen face the next day and said, I guess my career is over. And I said, no, you just jumped over another hurdle. You tripped, but your career is ahead of you. And his career has been remarkable. He taught for a number of years at the University of Hawaii, then went to Yonsei University, where he's an associate professor of Korean language and literature. His first book was The Politics of Gender in Colonial Korea, Education, Labor, and Health, 1910 to 1945. I'm laughing again because when I knew him, he was Yoo Jun, or Jun Yoo. But he became Theodore because people thought he was a woman, since he was writing on gender, and his Korean name is androgynous, but I had trouble calling it Ted or Theodore. His second book, which is also terrific, is called It's Madness, The Politics of Mental Health in Colonial Korea. He has a long title here, and we'll explain it, but I might as well give it for this lecture. The title of his talk today is You Only Live Twice. Dr. Mohammad Gansu, also known as Chung Soo-il, and the question of the diasporic other in the two Koreas. It's wonderful to have you back at your alma mater, and
thank you.
We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bruce, for that kind introduction, and Susan also. Really thankful to come to the University of Chicago and for you all for inviting me here. Very honored to be here. I want to start my talk by showing you two very random slides to kind of put into context what I'm trying to do. If you look at this, the first slide, you'll notice that the guy wearing this outfit, Binilan outfit, is Mengistu Haile Mariam, former dictator of Ethiopia, who's now living in Zimbabwe, although Mugabe's government has gone under. I don't know what he's going to do. But this is what I would call something before size Gangnam style. This was Pyongyang style. And in the 1980s, a lot of African leaders were donning these outfits, and they were given for free by Kim Il-sung to people like Mengistu, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, And if you can see, these outfits are made from limestone and coal. And the North Koreans really prided themselves in this outfit because, one, it was not made from cotton, meaning you didn't have to import or export, and this was what they called chuche fiber, and this was how anybody, for example, in Ethiopia who made 100 birr, or which was roughly $80 or more, would have to wear this particular outfit to show their social class, so to speak. So this is the first image I wanted to show you. And then this is the second image. And if you look at this image, you'll see that these are military uniforms. And if you look at the top there, I don't know if it's quite clear there, you'll see the sickle and hammer that's been sewed onto these uniforms, right? These uniforms were actually made by South Korea, by Chun Doo-hwan, and they were sold to African dictators in the 80s. So we're talking about chartered Korean Airlines flights to places like Kampala and Addis Ababa. And this is the time when South Korea is at the height of anti-communism, right? So here you see a contradiction here is, the first slide, North Korea is giving away uniforms. And here you have the South Koreans procuring US dollars by selling these uniforms when it's illegal to have communism in the South, so to speak. So here, what you get is a very interesting kind of view of what's happening in the 80s. What makes this story even more interesting is that the individuals selling these outfits, I did a kind of a study to see where these traders ended up, is they all went to seminary in the United States, became ordained ministers, and they are now in Myanmar building churches and hospitals. Another contradiction of, again, enabled by this particular period, and I'm going to talk about that just in a second. But what I want to emphasize here is a different type of story that I'm going to try to give today, which doesn't necessarily fit into the kind of mainstream history that you're all very familiar with. And what I want to show through this one individual today, Mohammad Gansu, is these kinds of contradictions that were being played out among people's lives, but also how government policies at the state level, but also internationally, altered the lives of certain individuals, in this case, this particular person. So my talk today is part of a larger book project, which will be coming out by UC Press next year, that explores the tale of twin nations separated by only through a fratricidal civil war. In contrast to standard histories, this book not only explains the internal developments of the two Koreas side by side, but integrates multiple Korean narratives within the larger process of globalization in world history, such as the diaspora experience, which offers a more holistic understanding of events, challenging the master narratives of national culture, homogeneity, belongingness, and identity. To humanize and to concretize this history, I focus on relatively unknown individuals or events drawing on popular culture and everyday life. So today's talk focuses on a very individual, Mohammad Gansu, later known as Jeong Soo-il. So on July 23rd, 1996, the Donghwa-ilbo, or the East Asia Daily, reported that the Anggibu, the Agency of National Security Planning, had arrested Mohammad Gansu, a 62-year-old distinguished foreign professor of Arabic history and culture at Dankook University, on charges of espionage and the use of a false identity as an Arab of Filipino-Lebanese descent to enter South Korea. Gansu was a prolific scholar and at one time the only expert in Arabic studies in South Korea, conversant in 12 languages and the author of half a dozen books and numerous journal articles on the Silk Road. He was also a household name, frequently contributing columns as a foreign guest writer for various local newspapers and magazines, and he delivered many lectures on Arabic culture and history at different universities in South Korea. He attended the Seoul Central Mosque at least twice a month and was a respected figure in the Muslim community in Seoul. His performance was so credible that his graduate advisor, Kim Won-mo, fellow students and colleagues at Dankook University, never even suspected that he was anything but an Arab. Having successfully evaded suspicion for 12 years, Gansu routinely faxed messages from various hotels in Seoul to a North Korean agent in Beijing. It was only through a simple fate of fate when a lobby attendant at the Plaza Hotel in Seoul misidentified him as a drug dealer after a botched fax at the Hotel Business Center, that he was arrested. The shocking revelation that Gansu was not really an Arab, but a North Korean spy masquerading as a 52-year-old academic took the country by surprise. Embarrassed over its failure to spot the fake identity and academic credentials, Dankook University immediately dismissed Gansu and stripped him of his doctorate degree. In addition, the Ministry of Education quickly replaced an excerpt he had written in a 7th grade middle school textbook in 1991 after realizing that they had been duped by a North Korean agent. For the authorities, this case represented a far more serious breach of security than common stealing identities by North Korean operatives in neighboring Japan. In fact, this was the first spy case which involved an international network and adoption of multiple nationalities by an individual who had infiltrated deeply into Korean intellectual and social circles. The court charged Gansu for espionage and abetting the enemy by sending summaries of domestic events that he culled from public newspapers and journals to a North Korean agent in Beijing. He confessed to the authorities during his interrogation that he had entered North Korea 4 times during July of 1987 and February of 1995 and received operational funds. He also corroborated the charges that he had received direct orders via radio 160 times since June of 1984 and sent 80 reports via fax mail from the business offices at various hotels. Motivated by Cold War logics and reinforced by extensive coverage of other high-profile spy cases, the furor over Gansu's elaborate scheme generated public fear. The public expressed little interest in understanding the complex circumstances that gave rise to his life choices, in particular the pressures that a diasporic Korean living in China like Gansu was forced to experience in the post-liberation era with the onset of the Cold War and national division. Drawing on Gansu's fascinating life story, my talk today sheds light on South Korea's blind and willful ignorance of the North due to its entrenched Cold War ideology and how it ironically enabled a diasporic Korean from China to pose as a Lebanese-Filipino Muslim scholar right under its nose to become one of the most accomplished scholars of Arabic studies. It also offers a sobering perspective on the anti-communist propaganda and psychological warfare in South Korea under the draconian National Security Act enforced since 1948. In contrast to other accounts of North Korean spies, it seeks to humanize the experience of Gansu to illustrate how a diasporic Korean employed survival strategies that he had learned during his life in China to navigate the social and political realities of national division and anxieties caused by global and internecine hostilities during the Cold War. To add yet another twist to this fascinating story, Gansu's arrest and imprisonment did not foreclose the possibility of becoming an academic again. In fact, he would re-emerge with enthusiasm after a special presidential pardon, amnesty by President Kim Dae-jung on April 30, 2003, and subsequent naturalization as a South Korean citizen on May 14th. He would author more than a dozen important monographs and encyclopedias on the Silk Road, as well as serve as the director of the Korean Institute of Civilization Exchanges, the first privately run research institute solely dedicated to the serious study of the Silk Road. Mohammad Gansu was born on March 2nd, 1934 in Longjing City, Lianbian Prefecture in Jilin Province, formerly known as Manchuria. Like many impoverished tenant farmers who were dispossessed of their rights to farm after the government general's cadastral survey immediately after Japan's colonization of the peninsula, Gansu's grandfather decided to leave Hamgyong Province, which is in North Korea, and crossed the border with his family to settle in northeast China, which later would become the puppet state of Manchukuo, to escape poverty and to seek a better future. Despite being caught in between Japanese colonial power and Chinese natives, tenant farmers like Gansu's grandfather deliberately took advantage of their ambiguous identities to sustain their village communities and to survive the wartime period. The collapse of the Japanese Empire in August of 1945 did not result in a peaceful transition of power, as almost 2 million ethnic Koreans would have to deal with 2 deadly civil conflicts: the Chinese Civil War and Revolution in 1949, and a bloody civil war that ensued on the Korean Peninsula between the northern and southern regimes for 8 years after the surrender of Japan, which profoundly shaped the trajectory of Gansu's life. Gansu's struggle with his identity and racism as a first-generation ethnic Korean resident in China provides a glimpse into his complex subjectivity in relationship to his originary homeland, which was now divided into two separate countries. While roughly 500,000 ethnic Koreans opted to return to North Korea after liberation, a significant number of farmers like Gansu's parents chose to remain in northeast China, where they adopted Chinese citizenship under the PRC's National Classification Project in 1954, comprising roughly 60% of Yeonbyeon Autonomous Prefecture, a newly established district for ethnic Koreans in Jilin Province. Between 1949 and 1951, during the height of the Chinese Revolution and Korean Civil Conflict, Kkansu attended Yeonbyeon High School and began to learn formal Mandarin for the first time. Upon graduation, he was selected as one of the two first ethnic minorities from his prefecture to be admitted to the prestigious Eastern Studies Department at Beida, a major pipeline for students wishing to enter the Chinese diplomatic corps. Despite a surprising academic success as a Chao Xianzu, or ethnic Korean Chinese, in the newly established PRC, his identity was still unstable, and such uncertainty influenced the way he identified personally and socially with China rather than Korea, at least during his college years. It would not be a stretch to argue that Gansu may have learned at a very young age how to dissimulate by adopting an ambiguous identity of hostile competing authorities. Just as ethnic Koreans navigated between Japanese colonial powers and Chinese nationalists in Manchukuo, Gansu would also have to negotiate his ambiguous ethnic position in the Chinese Foreign Service and later in North and South Korea. As an undergraduate student at Beida, Gansu continued to hone his Mandarin and became deeply immersed in Russian, which was considered a key language among diplomats during the height of the Cold War. After earning a bachelor's degree in 1955, Gansu, at the behest of his mentor, Ji Xiaolian, one of China's first Indologists at Beida, applied for prestigious Chinese scholarship and received a fellowship to study abroad in Egypt. Ji encouraged Gansu to learn Arabic and introduced him to a memoir of the pilgrimage to the Five Kingdoms of India, a travelogue written by Hecho, a Shilla monk who had traveled the Silk Road to India. Inspired by Ji's remarkable mastery of Indology through his experience of studying abroad at the University of Göttingen, Gansu enrolled himself in the School of Humanities at Cairo, University of Egypt, from 1956 to 58. Upon completion of his studies, Gansu passed the Foreign Service examination and took up a position in the Chinese Diplomatic Corps as a second-grade official in 1958 and accepted his first assignment in Rabat, Morocco in 1963. Gansu could have worked as a career diplomat, but discrimination against ethnic minorities in China and the lack of opportunity to move up the ranks may explain his return to North Korea with his wife in 1963. Ethnic Koreans certainly suffered major hardships during the anti-rightist campaigns of the 1950s, the Great Leap Forward, and later the Cultural Revolution, as Sino-Korean relations reached its low point. In April of 1968 alone, 175 Korean Chinese officials, or roughly 70% of Chinese Koreans in security offices, prosecutors' offices, and courts in Yeonbyeon were indicted as foreign spies. In the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee instruction to the Northeast Bureau, it mandated that if ethnic Koreans have social relations with North Korea, they have applied to participate in its development, we should allow them to move with no restriction. Moreover, unlike the South, North Korea was a very attractive place in the 1960s, and as an academic with all the opportunities that it offered as the second and most industrialized nation in Asia, trailing only Japan. After becoming naturalized as a North Korean, given his unique background and experience, Gansu found employment as a professor in the Eastern Studies Department at Pyongyang International Relations University from 1964 to 68, and then in the Eastern Studies Department at Pyongyang International Language University from 1969 to 74, teaching Arabic. In contrast to the southern counterparts, which relied on American patronage through economic and military aid, the DPRK sought to project its assets and influence abroad by asserting itself as the beacon to post-colonial states in Africa and Asia, as well as the vanguard of the struggling masses of the world after the final communique of the African-Asia Conference in Bandung in 1955. By the 1960s, several new African nation-states started to embrace Kim's Juche philosophy as a model of autonomous industrialization and development. For example, in 1969, the DPRK organized the first Juche idea study group in Mali and started to build their own brand of internationalism. For Gansu, the socioeconomic and political changes in the DPRK during the 1960s represented a world apart from the poverty that he had experienced living among tenant farmers in Yanbian. In February of 1960, Kim Il-sung introduced the Cheongsang-ri spirit and method to instill a sense of responsibility among workers by giving them a stake in management, echoing the core spirit of an egalitarian model of management that was both top-down and bottom-up. On the political front, the fundamentals of Juche ideology, which emphasized political independence, economic self-sustenance and self-reliance and defense, would become the central pillars of the party, which Kim Il-sung spelled out in a speech on April 14, 1965. However, in the South, the Republic of Korea signed the Korea-Japan Basic Treaty in 1965, normalizing diplomatic relations with their former colonial leaders, receiving more than $200 million in public loans, $300 million in grants, an additional $300 million in commercial credits, as well as technological and business expertise, which would help incorporate South Korea into the Japanese economic zones. South Korean enterprises assumed the low technology, labor-intensive, pollution-producing, and low value-added production that Japanese companies had abandoned, allowing for easy transfer of production technology to South Korea. With this infusion of cash and buoyed by security alliance with Japan and the United States through this normalization treaty, Park's regime embarked on rapid industrialization, dubbed as the Miracle on the Han River. These separate ideological approaches to the economy set the two Koreas on divergent post-colonial paths during the age of globalization when the world markets experienced a significant upsurge in trade. Whereas the South hitched its fortunes on the development of expanding Northeast Asian economic system anchored by Japan, the North increasingly turned inward towards self-sustainment, which would have ramifications for its future. At the same time, the DPRK sought to establish itself on the world stage through competitive sports, starting in 1964 in Innsbruck, Austria, as it entered the world's largest sporting event, with Han Pil-hwa garnering a silver medal in the women's 3,000 speed skating event. 2 years later, the North Korean soccer team defeated the formidable and favored Italian squad at Ryerson Park in 1966 FIFA World Cup. This was the first time that a nation outside Europe or the Americas had qualified past the first round of the tourney. In other words, these were exciting times for someone like Gansu to live in the DPRK. It was vital for the regime to underscore the symbolic importance of these victories. The North treated these victories in sports as proof of its superiority over their ideological enemies in the Cold War. It also touted the fact that 6 defectors from the United States, including the late Charles Jenkins, would star in several propaganda films on behalf of the North Korean government. Other well-known Americans like Eldridge Cleaver, the leader of the Black Panthers, traveled to the DPRK in the 1960s, lauding it as an earthly paradise and a beacon in the vanguard of the struggling masses of the world. The raucous April 19th revolution in 1960 that drove President Syngman Rhee out of power in the 1961 military coup d'etat paved the way for a military-sponsored developmental state. Park Chung-hee's draconian economic measures to wrench his country out of poverty at any cost had a profound impact on the everyday lives of South Koreans. Park's regime resorted to strict, even draconian control at the top to embark on rapid industrialization despite heavy costs in imported goods, ideas, and culture from its patron, the United States. Unlike the North, which welcomed people from developing nations to Pyongyang, the South encouraged its people to immigrate abroad, triggering the third wave of Korean immigration to Latin America and the United States in the 1960s. Between 1963 and 65, South Korea also sent 3,809 miners and nurses to West Germany, whose remittances would be used to the regime to jumpstart its ambitious economic transformations. The United States intervention in Vietnam also generated a bonanza for South Korean companies and opportunities for young men from poor and disadvantaged backgrounds to participate as mercenaries in the war under the More Flags campaign. Between October of 1965 and March of 1973, over 300,000 South Korean soldiers fought in the Vietnam conflict as the U.S. military aid doubled after South Korea committed its troops as war-related income generated more than $1 billion during this period, constituting more than 3.5% of its GNP. These two very divergent paths culminated into a series of provocations, starting with the infiltration of the Blue House by a 31-member North Korean commando team whose intent was to assassinate President Park before they were intercepted by South Korean police. 2 days after the assassination attempt, North Korea seized the U.S. intelligence ship Pueblo with a crew of 83 near Wonsan, and soon thereafter the number of hostile conflicts between the North and South along the DMZ increased significantly in 1968. These violent clashes would have a direct impact on Gansu's life in the DPRK. Given Gansu's supreme command of Arabic, 4 Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Persian, as well as 5 Western languages, Russian, German, French, Spanish, and English, it would not be an exaggeration to say that he was an ideal candidate to be recruited by the DPRK authorities to become a spy. The main duties of the number 35 Department of the Workers' Party under the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the party involved espionage activities and terrorist operations in the South and other destinations abroad. Gansu would be recruited to work for the Daenam Gongjak, or the North Korean espionage operations in the South unit, starting in September of 1974, and he would train for the next 5 years in espionage while spending a considerable amount of time working on enhancing his spoken Arabic and grooming himself to resemble a typical Middle Eastern man. Very little is known about this chapter in Gansu's life, perhaps given the high risks of disclosing sensitive information which would result in the punishment of his family members in North Korea. During the mid-1970s, hundreds of North Koreans served in Africa as technical experts, propagandists, agricultural engineers, and military advisors, providing economic, cultural, and military assistance on a very wide scale up until the 1990s. The DPRK also became a major destination for students among developing African and Middle East nations, and would claim an important role in the South-to-South cooperation and non-alignment movement. According to the Anggibu reports, Gansu left Pyongyang in January of 1979 as Icheolsu and acquired a Lebanese passport the following month. There's little information about how many years Gansu spent in North Africa and the Middle East, but he claimed to have worked at the Social Economic Research Institute in Tunis as a researcher at Tunisia University and earned a master's degree from 1980 to 81. He allegedly earned both his Bachelor's of Science and Master's degree at Beirut Arab University in his early monographs, which he later deleted from his biography after being indicted. It is most likely that he obtained his Lebanese citizenship during his studies as the civil war was brewing and as North Korean military involvement in both Syria and Lebanon started to increase in the 1970s. It became more apparent to Gansu that it would be extremely difficult to enter South Korea with a Lebanese passport without soliciting suspicion. There's also another big void in his narrative from 1979 to 82. One might surmise that he was remaking his identity as an Arab from Southeast Asia to infiltrate into South Korea. This would explain his itinerant life and travels to Papua New Guinea, Australia, and to several Southeast Asian countries in early of 1982. He would eventually stay in Indonesia before securing a position as a lecturer at the University of Malaya in the Academy of Islamic Studies from July of 82 to 1984, before his subsequent acquisition of a Filipino citizenship in February of 1984. North Korea provided substantial financial and military assistance to the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army, a Maoist guerrilla army founded in 1969, which could explain why Gansu was able to forge citizenship documents and obtain a passport more easily in the Philippines. So, on April 29, 1984, Gansu received a student visa and entered South Korea, claiming that he was a second-generation Lebanese born in the Philippines. While teaching at the University of Malaya in Malaysia, he befriended a visiting Korean professor whom he later contacted in February of 1984 to inquire about the possibilities of honing his language skills at the Korea Language Institute at Yonsei University. And he came in, I checked his transcript, at level 2. He was admitted to Dankook University later in September that year, and as the first international student in their doctoral history program. Between 1984 to 89, Kkansu embarked on his lifelong dream to write a dissertation on the history of civilization exchanges, which he later completed, entitled A Study of the History of Shilla and Arabic-Islamic Empire Relationships. For Gansu, performing his Arabness in South Korea required having an outward Arab appearance, displaying stereotypical dark curly hair, olive skin tones, gold-rimmed spectacles, and a masculine facial feature which included sporting a mustache. As Wendy Roth has observed in her study of Latinos in the United States, individuals only have limited control over how they are perceived racially by others. While physical cues might have been adequate for Gansu, he also strategically deployed culture and performance purposefully by altering his behavior by faking an Arab accent or adopting a persona of being multilingual, which led his colleagues to regard him both as Arab and a cosmopolitan in different circumstances. His ability to act out everyday performances of the other became so real that he deceived his colleagues in the department at Dankook University into believing that he was actually an Arab. In many ways, it exposes in a very disquieting way how master narratives of national culture, homogeneity, belongingness, and identity can be performative and predicated on learning certain racial schemas like Arabness or South Koreanness. In a rare twist, Gansu was able to act out who he was and what he wanted to be seen because of the grossly stereotypical ideas and visual representations of Arabs and North Koreans by the mass media. For Koreans, the Arab world was a major overseas destination for Korean male workers seeking employment in construction projects from early 1970 to the 1980s. And while the typical duration of their stint overseas was more than 3 years, a small percentage of these migrant workers who went abroad to Libya and elsewhere converted to Islam. However, despite being a sending nation, the vast majority of Koreans could not distinguish the terms Islam, Muslim, or Arabs, lumping the Arab world into one collective of oil magnates and a desert scattered with sheiks and camels, which were common images that they encountered in Western films as the James Bond 007 series, 007 series, or imported Hong Kong films. While Gansu was able to exploit such a profound cultural ignorance and general lack of awareness of Arabs or Muslims, he arrived in Seoul 4 years after the bloody civil uprising in Gwangju, where Chun Doo-hwan's forces massacred more than 600 civilians, which generated mass civil protests against his military-style dictatorship. Furthermore, tensions between the two Koreas worsened during the 1980s under Ronald Reagan's anti-communist crusades, which tolerated and even abetted autocratic leaders like Chun Doo-hwan, despite his anti-democratic activities to contain communism during the height of the Cold War. Domestically, under such volatile political conditions, South Korea's Red Scares offered a compelling rationale for extinguishing any form of dissent against the dictatorship, as psychological warfare campaigns touched upon every aspect of everyday life, from books and films to the regimentation of behavior. Any 40 or 50-year-old South Korean today could recount stories of being told in elementary school to draw pictures of red devils or to recite famous statements like "I hate communists" by Lee Seung-bok, a 9-year-old boy whose alleged murder by North Korean commandos in 1968 was widely publicized to mythic proportions by Park Chung-hee's regime. Much like the United States during the 1950s, red-baiting projects and anti-communist sentiments affected nearly every arena of cultural production to trigger fear, anxiety, and a new mode of hyper-patriotism. By producing an authoritative version of the enemy that was dramatized and simplified, the South Korean state expected its people to accept uncritically the clear and present dangers that seemed to lurk around every corner. It highlighted the most damaging stereotypical ones that dehumanized the North as primitive, brutal, inhumane, poor, and oppressive, which certainly had a potent effect on how Koreans visualized their northern enemy through the manufacturing of fear of the Pukpung, which is northern wind, or Chokwa Tongil, red unification. For Gansu, the performance of his Arabness allowed him to completely fly under the radar, using his privileged position as a foreigner and scholar frequently attending a mosque to circumvent any charges of being a North Korean spy. Ironically, his erudite scholarship offered a shield for him to do whatever he wanted, and in a perversely ironic way, thrive as a scholar in the most oppressive conditions. As a foreign scholar, Gansu was not under any duress to engage in any of the anti-communist activities required of civilians, urging them to listen, to see, and to report any spies by calling a special hotline number. These red-baiting tactics calling for the outing of those who displayed leftist sentiments not only instilled fear, but also hatred of the enemy, contributing to the internalization of anti-communism. Likewise, the fear of being accused of being a spy contributed to self-censorship and the surveillance of each other. Despite these draconian laws, Gansu not only completed his degree at Dankook University, he established himself as the foremost expert in Arabic culture, history, and society. Gansu was offered the first visiting professorship in Arabic studies to a foreigner at Dankook University in 1988, the year Seoul hosted the 24th Summer Olympiad, where a total of 159 nations, the largest number since the Cold War era, participated in the games, minus the DPRK. 2 years earlier, Gansu was hired as an instructor of Arabic to prepare docents and volunteers for the Asian Games. The South Korean government used the Olympics as a coming-out party to celebrate its transformation into a modern, democratic, and industrialized nation within the world, making a significant shift from the Cold War in which South Korea had been embroiled since its birth as a modern state. South Korea also established diplomatic relations with China and Russia, opening its borders to ethnic Koreans to return to the homeland in 1992, marking a historic milestone for South Korea. The rapprochement among two Cold War neighbors paved the way for ethnic Koreans from Russia, Koryo Saram, the Sakhalin Islands, and China, Joseonjok, to file for immigration. For Gansu, however, the new relationship worked the other way around. Normalization with China allowed him several opportunities for debriefing on his activities with his superiors in North Korea, but also to reconnect with family members living in Yeonbyeon and North Korea before his arrest. On the political front in the South, Kim Il-sung's successful bid as the first civilian president in more than 3 decades marked the end of military rule, and his Haegyewa, or globalization initiative, opened up a trade and pushed for financial liberalization of South Korean economy. As South Koreans felt the impact of neoliberalism triggered by free trade, market deregulation, and state decentralization on businesses as well as their everyday lives, the North experienced a much more powerful earthquake as Kim Il-sung's marked the transition of power from father to son, as an untested Kim Jong-il at the helm created a more complicated situation for Gansu, which would explain his subsequent arrest. On July 3, 1996, the Anggibu arrested Gansu for sending a fax from the Plaza Hotel in Seoul to a North Korean contact in Beijing. The Anggibu charged him with sending more than 80 reports via fax or airmail to contacts in the North, a serious violation of national security. Using signal intelligence surveillance to monitor Gansu, agents confiscated $19,000 in cash, a shortwave radio, cryptograms, ampules, and other spy paraphernalia from Gansu's home. So routine was his faxing to Beijing that he had become very accustomed to not carrying ampules with him to the hotel and violated the spy protocols which he had learned in the North. On July 21st, Gansu confessed to the authorities of his true identity and involvement in various espionage activities, as well as making several clandestine trips to North Korea between 1984 to 1996. Before being sentenced to 12 years at Hwawon prison, which is now Daegu prison, at the age of 62, Gansu offered a Jeonhwan, or a conversion statement, expressing a complete disavowal of the northern system and major anguish for being a cold-hearted individual and abandoning his family in the north. He claimed that he had abandoned his wife, Park Kwang-suk, a well-known dancer and choreographer, and 3 daughters. To him, the only way to seek atonement was through renouncement, and expressed his desire to want to live like a righteous Korean and to resume his studies. Dankook University canceled all of his courses and revoked his doctoral degree on the basis of identity fraud and dishonoring the integrity of the university. In an interview with Shisa Journal, Gansu, who had changed his name to Jeong after his conversion, Compare this piercing
pain it endured to the experience by the Han Dynasty scholar Sima Qian, the father of Chinese historiography, who had written the author of the records of the historian, who later had to atone for his crime by undergoing castration, as so to complete his history rather than committing suicide.
Method expected of a gentleman scholar. While Gansu's sentencing to prison made major headlines in the news, two calamitous events occurred in the north and the south again, which would again change his life and contribute to his early release.
A major famine in North Korea triggered by floods and droughts resulted in the widespread starvation and malnutrition, with the death toll reaching the thousands by 1997. In the south, a severe financial
crisis compelled the state to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund in the amount of $60 billion to counter the depletion of its foreign exchange reserves. On the political front, Kim Dae-jung's presidential election victory in December of 1997
prompted a détente with the North as Kim's Sunshine policy
sought to erase tensions on the divided Korean peninsula and to bring about peace and reconciliation, which culminated in a historic summit in 2000 in Pyongyang with Kim Jong-il. As these major events took place outside the prison gates, Kkansu, using the bottom of a pail as his desk in his 26.6 square feet prison cell, started to handwrite his 1,092-page tome on the Silk Road, going through 25,000 pages of drafts. So let me conclude here. On August 15, 2000, Kkansu was released after 4 years and a month in a solitary cell, and subsequently given a presidential pardon by Kim Dae-jung in 2003 with 3,586 prisoners, and then naturalized as a South Korean in 2005, and that's when he changed his name to Chung Soo-il. At one level, Kim's Sunshine policy, which had created a less hostile stance vis-a-vis the North and an atmosphere of peace and reconciliation, allowed Jeong to stave off execution or life imprisonment for espionage. A commuted sentence allowed him to adjust back to normalcy as he published more than a dozen monographs on the Silk Roads by reputable presses like Changbi, including translations of Ibn Battuta's travels. In 2008, he helped establish the Korea Institute of Civilization Exchanges and continues to serve as director at the age of 83. In 2013, Changbi published Jeong's magnus opus, the Cyclopdia of the Silk Roads, a 1,089-page encyclopedia on the Silk Road, a project he had started in prison where he had completed 974 entries by hand. He spent an additional 15 years of research and 40 trips abroad to various sites after his release from prison to complete the second half of the manuscript. In 2014, Changbi published Jeong's two other volumes, the Cyclopedia of Sea Silk Road, another encyclopedia with 621 entries related to exchanges between civilizations through maritime networks, and the Silk Road, a book featuring 900 photographs with commentaries. Reflecting on his whirlwind life in an interview, he notes, "I could have been successful in China if I had stayed as a Chinese national, but I had always considered myself as a Korean. As a young intellectual, I wanted to contribute to my people. I have no regrets. I never wished I was Chinese." While there is much irony and ambiguity in the statement, Jeong's life story exemplifies the way in which historical circumstances forced many diasporic Korean populations to live parallel lives, at once demonstrating a sheer will and a remarkable ability to survive under hostile conditions in a foreign land and learn how to dissimulate by adopting an ambiguous identity. And yet, despite suffering various setbacks, Chung Soo-il never deterred from his true passion to study the Silk Road and to take advantage of any situation that came his way, such as using a rusty pail as a desk to write manuscripts in this prison cell. For 25 years, Chung Soo-il lived as a diasporic Korean in China, 15 years in the DPRK, another 10 itinerating around the world like his favorite Shilla monk Hecho and the famous Moroccan scholar and traveler Muhammad ibn Battuta, and another 20-somewhat years in South Korea, changing his citizenship a total of 5 times. In respect, in Chung Soo-il's case, the truth is stranger than fiction. He was a remarkable chameleon who knew how to adapt to every new cultural situation, whether it was Beijing, Cairo, Pyongyang, Beirut, Tunis, Kuala Lumpur, Manila, or Seoul. While he seemed to be able to improvise his identity to fit his needs, his priority was his scholarship. To be sure, there are many contradictions and gaps about his personal life, but his unwavering commitment to his research has not waned despite all the hardship that he has gone through. While he is well into his 80s now, Jeong has yet to retire and is one of the foremost experts of the Silk Road and is completing the final volume of his Silk Road trilogy entitled The Cyclopdia of Civilization Exchanges, which will feature 5 entries that include North Africa and Latin America. Thank you.